It is actually in our report, which I didn't bring full copies of, but there's a nice, easy to look at digital report online, and the last page of our slides have the web address for that. We actually have a whole discussion about that at the very beginning, because I think this issue of whether or not a four-year degree still matters has been increasingly in the media and in the popular media. I'll certainly let Hans address that. What I would say, though, is that certainly the returns to a degree are very different if you have a four-year credential than not having a credential at all. And I think there tends to be a little bit of a tendency towards the exceptionalism. So we see some examples of folks who are able to get into perhaps a high-tech opportunity. Part of what I'm concerned about is not just their immediate opportunity, but their long-term opportunity and what it means over time for folks to, because we know labor markets are not what they once were. People don't stay in jobs forever. Experience matters, but degrees matter also oftentimes just to knock at the door. And so we want to ensure that people have some kind of degree or credential that gives them both opportunity to move around as well as an opportunity just to be heard. So
that is the lecture that my kids will be getting, and one that we can amplify. Yeah.
My kids get that every night.
Show your kids figure 3 from the PPIC report that you have in front of you that shows college wage premiums are at an all-time high and they've been growing rapidly. But you're right. I mean, there are different avenues to success, and getting a bachelor's degree or a graduate degree is not a guarantee of success. But I can tell you, on average, people who do that fare much better in the marketplace than people who don't, and that's actually more true now than it was historically. So despite information we hear from some about, there's this Silicon Valley tech guy who happens to have several degrees from colleges himself, who encourages students to not go to college and become entrepreneurs instead. And that might be fine for some few select people, but for the vast majority of kids, probably your kids, I know for my kids, going to college, getting that four-year degree matters, and it will make a big difference in their life. And I would say this, too, because this is an important point, and it always comes up in these discussions, is I have a nephew who graduated with an English degree from UC Davis, and he's working at Starbucks right now. And the answer is, yeah, that's not completely uncommon. But the other part of the answer, which doesn't often get told, is over his or her lifetime, their economic returns for that college degree will almost certainly be much more than the cost of going to college. And the trajectory for his or her career because of that degree is very different than his or her coworker who has only graduated from high school.
One other point that I would make is in terms of looking at debt in the state of California, California students actually have amongst the least amount of student debt compared to many other states. I mean, we are very fortunate in many ways because we have a very generous Cal Grant program, but California students don't hold anywhere near the debt as many other states. Part of it has to do with our publicly funded institutions, how much they're accessed, that 72%, right? So,
thank you. Mr. Williams?
Well, I was just gonna underscore that your figure 3 has a percentage increase or percentage average wage that is higher for a college graduate. But in terms of a starting wage, that's still, for most people, $20,000 or more on average that someone with a college degree is going to get. And over their lifetime, as cited in your data, that can range depending on how needed of a degree it is, between hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars of a premium for being, having a four-year degree. And I think that's pretty important to talk about too. Yeah, do you want to incur 40 grand worth of debt? No, but if you're getting paid $20,000 to $30,000 to $40,000 more a year, probably that's worth that investment. Just from a dollars and cents perspective, not just from a societal benefit perspective, which is also sometimes lost in this discussion. I wanted to hone in on this 10% and percentage need. I think that seems really intimidating to all of us, but if you broke that, half of that from enrollment increases and half of that from increased graduations, if we really meant to do this, we could accomplish that. If we really wanted to look at funding, the mix of funding and accountability necessary to increase enrollment by 5% a year, we could do that. We have the economic ability as a state to do that. We have the budgetary ability as a state to do that. And couple that with moves to increase graduations, we could close that gap. So I just hope people don't look at that figure and say, well, I guess there's nothing we can do, right? Well, we could do it. We just have to have the will to do it. And that means questions of investment and policy changes. So one of the things I wanted to ask you is, what can we do to substantively incentivize people taking a higher load but not taking such a higher load that they drop out, right? I mean, and is that, in your view, if you could change any of our policy mechanisms, would you require higher amounts of units to be taken to get certain types of financial aid, but have to couple that with higher financial aid awards so that people don't have to work as much to get through college? What would you do?
Sure. So I'll start. So I'm a big believer in the power of information for students and for parents. I honestly don't know, and I don't think any of us know, how many students, when they hear that 12 units is a full load, how many of them don't know that that means that they can't graduate in 4 years? So the first thing I would do would be to help students fully understand the implications of going to school at only a 12-unit pace. And then clearly one of the biggest disincentives then is you're going to have to pay for a year 5, and the family's going to, or the family
is going to cost you $30,000 more at least if if you include living expenses.
Right, which is probably larger than any incentive or disincentive we're talking about with respect to other kinds of grant or incentive programs. Having said that, I think that just as I think we've seen with the community colleges and the tremendous focus on student success and completion that started with the Community College Student Success Task Force many years ago, and has led to, I think, a lot of innovation in the community colleges with respect to student success, and we're going to see how all that gets played out. For CSU in particular, where it's the bigger challenge, I think that focus on graduating in 4 years is something that's starting to happen more and more. And all kinds of things like degree audits, figuring out how far a student is from that, and letting students know. So information sharing, again, you could do that in any number of ways. You could text students, you need to do this next semester to be able to finish in 4 years. Those kinds of things, I think, are smart to start with. I don't have any research on any of that because we haven't tried it, and there isn't any good data on it. But I think those are the kind of common sense approaches I would first start with, because they're not really very expensive. And I think they would go to the heart of some of the problems that students might have in terms of not having the right kind of information. At the end of the day, I do think you would have to help students. Especially, we know CSU students are often working, right? And so taking 15 units and working 20 hours a week, that's going to be pretty tough. So you either need to figure out a way to have students not work quite so much, which would be increasing their grant aid, so it allows for more than just tuition and fees, but pays for some living expenses. Or encouraging them to take out loans, which I don't think is a very popular approach for a lot of students, and maybe not for this body either.
Yeah, I would just add to that, I agree that the information piece is a huge barrier for many students. One of the things, our organization was very interested in what was happening with the Innovation Prize last year, so we read all of those applications and came up with our own rubric and scored them ourselves. And one of the things we did and understood from those is fully, I think, 2/3 of those applications last year had something to do with advising. The advising function within our colleges is severely diminished, and so students aren't getting the kind of information they need to be able to move through at a pace that's both cost-effective and efficient. And so what you're finding is students are trying to figure out, how do I hold on to my aid, and how do I make sure I get my classes, and if I can't get it there, where can I go to get it? I mean, I think today's college students are amongst the most enterprising in the nation in California, because they are figuring out how to move through a system that is not always well organized for them to move through. And so I think really trying to figure out what needs to be done in terms of supporting that advising function is essential. The other thing I would say is, in addition, to trying to find support for those students, increasingly what we are seeing is that it is not necessarily tuition that is pushing students away from school. It is the total cost of attendance. It is books. It is transportation. It is the cost of living. One of our like-minded colleagues, I suppose, Debbie Cochran at the Institute for College Access and Success, has a very powerful slide that she does in presentations that shows that it is actually more expensive for a student to try and go to Berkeley City College than to go to UC Berkeley. And that is because they are in the same housing market. So you may have a BOG fee waiver that waives away their tuition. That's not the expensive cost for them. It is to live there. It is to eat there. It is to get around. That's the expensive cost. And so I think increasingly, if we're thinking about what we need to do to support students, we need to be thinking about how we support the total cost of attendance and not only tuition and fees.
Okay. Mr. Chavez?
Can I just reinforce one of the points? I have yet to meet a community college student, and I was one of these community college students who has not taken a course that they thought was going to count. That does not. I talk to hundreds of city college students a year, and I have yet to meet one that we talk about this issue who has not, mistakenly taken a course that they thought was going to count towards their transfer that did not. So we are providing too little information, too little counseling, and not just counseling, because counseling is a general discipline, but academic advising is a specific discipline in the community college context to make sure that folks know if they're not taking a course for credit that they know what they're doing, and it seems strange that we have a system where the highest achieving schools offer no choice over what courses you take the first 2 years, and the lowest achieving schools, the schools for kids like me who had a rough time, we offer unlimited choice and no advice about how to get a path. If I could redo our system, I would send more of our higher achieving students to community college and more of our shakier achieving students to the UC and CSU. But I just think that that's really important and something we have to address. We are wasting their time, and they are spending more money and dropping out more because we are contributing to wasting their time.
Mr. Chavez?
I just push back a little bit on that. I remember when I went to college, and being a first person in my entire family to even go to college, very few of us even graduated from high school. Used to say the hardest part of college is to be able to figure out what classes to take. But it was a math problem. You still need 120 units to graduate from college, the BA. If you're taking 12 hours a semester with 2 semesters, that's 24. I mean, that's a simple math question that somebody figured out in 3rd grade, that you're not going to do it in 4 years. Just a thought. But the question I have for you, directly to your presentation, is that when you were talking about the different degrees and opportunities, do you balance your report against the Employment Development Department of California as they identified the fastest growing occupations in California from 2012 through 2022?
Our report did not look at that, but I think
your report look at that?
analysis did.
We use their occupational projections. They do not attach educational attainment levels to occupations when they do those projections. That's what we did. And then we also extended them to 2030 based on the pattern of growth that we had observed historically and that they had implied in their projections. So yes, we did.
So if you look at their report, how many, and I've asked this question a number of times, in our society, what percent of people need to have a bachelor degree as identified by California's employment data?
So really, again, they do not come up with that number. We did. It was 38% of workers in California by 2030 would need to have at least a bachelor's degree. So again, that's not the majority of workers, but it is an increase, a substantial increase over where we are today. And it is more, that increase is larger than we are on a pace to produce in our state.
And you're going to 2030, and this report they have, when you look them up, is only to 2022.
Right. So we extended their occupational projections to 2030 and then did our series. But
because when I look at it and you look at the numbers, I'll just grab one at the top. It's growing at a 24% rate increase. Software development, you make $118,000 a year. But really, in 2012, we have 79,300 jobs, and it's projected to be 98,300 jobs. So that's not a dramatic increase in the amount of jobs statewide.
No, exactly. And in fact, but all of these are all marginal contributions to where we're going as an economy. And what we found was that a lot of this increase was actually occurring within occupations, not in terms of an occupational shift. And then finally, I would note also, we saw, and this is from the EDD projections, there's a bifurcation of the labor market going forward, with the fastest growing jobs either being those that tend to require a college degree, but then also, well, about half of the fastest growing jobs in California, half of them require at least a bachelor's degree, or occupations that require a bachelor's degree. The other half require very little education. So we have very different wages in those two relatively fast-growing sectors of the economy, which, of course, is a lot of the reason why people are concerned about and are talking about things like wage inequality.
And that's why I was looking at this, and because, the smaller numbers, software development, but if you look at construction labor, we have 108,000. We're going to require to go to 140,000, and their average pay is about $40,000 a year. Right. And then if you look at brick masonry, so other skills, and masonry is a skill, they're in the hundreds of thousands of jobs. When you're looking at software, you're looking at 10,000 or 15,000 jobs. So I'm just wondering if we're really meeting the true needs of what the society needs to be competitive according to their projections. Or maybe we need to look at changing the matrix of this and bringing in new industries, so it's a more of a higher tech industry versus all this construction and things we have here. The largest one for the members up here, the largest one that really surprised me, I guess it shouldn't have, was personal care aides that are actually going to grow over 200,000 jobs. So that's, just thought I'd add that to our discussion. Considering that we educate people to eventually get a job. And so are we really scoping our education to the jobs we need?
Mr. Was that a question or a comment, the last piece?
That was my comment.
Gotcha.
It was shorter than his. So.
Okay, Mr. Medina.
I want to thank the panel. I think Figure 5 is a stark presentation of what the future needs of California are going to be relative to those who do have or don't have a college education. And I like the comments that I heard about disparities. But before I get to that one, I want to ask the panel, if you would think that setting goals would be a valuable setting goals. We know what we're going to need. I think one report said 1 million short BAs. Other one may have said 2 million short. Would setting a goal for the state of California on how and reaching of how many individuals we would need by a certain date, would that be valuable to the state? Just to set the goal.
So Yogi Berra said something like, if you don't know where you're going, you're sure to get there. Certainly setting a goal doesn't mean you're going to get to that goal. But if you don't have a goal, you won't get to it because you don't have one. So I think, yes, you have to have a goal.
Something we should strive for.
I could think of a time when we did have a goal. It's 1960. We established a master plan for higher education in California. That master plan was established because there was an anticipation, correct, that there was going to be a tremendous growth in the number of young adults in our state. It allowed for the top 1/8 of students to go to UC, the top 1/3 to go to CSU. That was in an economy in which only about 10 or 11% of jobs required a bachelor's degree then, 50 years ago, as I just testified. Now we're almost up to, we will be up to almost 40%, and yet we haven't changed those eligibility thresholds. We haven't changed those goals. Many people, of course, have argued that we've moved away from the master plan entirely. But that was an example of a goal we set as a state. We actually did a tremendous job in terms of increasing the number of colleges, the number of enrollment slots, and provided a way for students in California to go to college relatively cheaply, even free, and earn a bachelor's degree. And it worked. We had a goal. We funded it. It worked.
When you point to the master plan, which I think was 1960 that it was established, and we said the percentage of high school graduates that would be accepted into UC, and that figure was 12%?
12.5%.
12.5%. And then we put a figure for how many would be accepted into the CSU system, which was
top 1/3.
Top 1/3. With impaction today on the CSU campuses and getting tougher to get accepted into UC, I hear students with 4.0s being turned away. Are we actually accepting those numbers in California, the ones that we had set out in 1960?
I guess that's a question for our colleagues sitting behind us. What I would say about those targets is that those have been targets that have how they've been implemented in different years over the last 50 plus years is different. So there have been years where even though the target is 12.5%, that some UCs have taken more, and they've taken 16 or 18%. And then there are also years that a student who's in the top 12.5% in their school, in their grade, can't get into UC because they really need to be top 5% in their class in order to be able to matriculate at the UC. So I think, how those get interpreted has changed over the years. I think it is a legitimate policy question to ask whether or not the targets that we set in 1960 are the same targets that would serve the needs of the state of California today. I think that's an important policy conversation to have.
Okay. As far as equity, I see the disparity. And we saw a couple of weeks ago when the Black Caucus had Black Minds Matter, and I sat in through all that discussion. And it was very glaring, the disparity in achievement between Latino and African American students. I see the same disparities brought out here. What recommendations would you make to the legislature to narrow that achievement gap? Are there programs that that work? Is there things that we could do to close that gap? That's a pretty big question.
It's a big question. The way in which I think about policies is I think about what are the policies that we need for the state of California, and then I want to superimpose a lens on each of those policies to ask the question, does this also meet our overall goals in terms of advancing equity in the state? So I think that there are a range of policies that we could look at, but I would always look at every policy through that lens of, does it meet our equity agenda as well? I think the issue that I spoke to earlier around the total cost of attendance is a really significant one. For example, I think for a lot of students, there are students who choose to go to perhaps a school that is near their home because trying to go to a different institution that might actually meet their needs better is more difficult because it's further away. The cost of living is higher. So I actually think paying attention to those things that we know to be barriers to college access is a part of the equation, and that if we are able to just take all of the policies that we have and look at them through an equity lens, it'll give us a sense of where we can kind of do some deeper outreach to students.
If you increase the share of students that are eligible for UC and CSU, in a previous report we suggested UC move to the top 15% rather than the top 12.5%. CSU moved to the top 40% rather than the top third, and we had suggested implementing that incrementally over time. So it didn't occur overnight, which would create some problems. But if you did that, you would have a much more diverse pool of students that were attending those institutions than when you are selecting for an even lower percentage. So that's one thing you could do that doesn't even require a change in the K-12 system, for example. But at the end of the day, we need to make sure that our K-12 system is working better for all students, and certainly this body and the state's educators in K-12 are working with a kind of new rubric with some of the local control funding and accountability programs, and we'll see how all of that works out. But ultimately, the goal is to produce more college-ready students from every group. And if that works, then we have a problem, is how are we going to accommodate them if we're still only allowing the same 50-plus-year-old eligibility level into UC and CSU? So if our K-12 reforms work, and let's hope they do, then on the higher ed side, we need to make sure we are able to accommodate those increasing number of college-ready students who will be more diverse, representing more underrepresented groups at UC and CSU than we currently see today. That's a kind of long-term solution. I don't know if it gets to the heart of your question. I think there are some short-term things you can do that look promising again. There are programs called, and I'm a big believer in information, is early commitment to college programs that are offered in some middle schools. There's some stellar examples of providing students in middle school and their parents with information about what is required. California is quite clear what's required to get into UC or CSU. It's the A through G criteria with a certain grade point average and an SAT score of a certain level. Other states, it's fuzzier. So at least we have a very clearly defined pathway that you have to pursue. We need to provide students more help in figuring that pathway out for themselves and their parents helping them and the schools helping them. But the right time to do it is before they've started down that pathway, which it is certainly middle school. You can't, by the time you get to high school, it's going to be hard to get a student to finish the A through G courses if they're a senior and they haven't done it yet.
Okay.
I have one last question. Sure. As we look at the disparity throughout the state, ethnic, racial, also geographic disparities, which I, didn't see addressed. But I know that certain parts of the states have much higher college achievement than other parts of the state. And I know the part of the state that I'm from, that I represent, the Inland Empire, like other inland parts of the state of California, Central Valley, are much lower. What can we do to address that?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because kind of phase 2 of this analysis is actually to be able to do some of this, understand some of these numbers as they have an impact regionally. So Hans and I have been thumb wrestling for who gets the privilege of being able to analyze those numbers. I think I'm going to let Hans do it, but.
Where we have some of the lowest college going rate in the state of California, startling lower.
We actually are starting to do some work on regional breakdowns, and our 3 key regions right now are the San Joaquin Valley, the Inland Empire, and Los Angeles County, and we'll be doing some more work in those areas.
So no suggestions at this point?
Not yet.
Stay tuned.
Okay. Thank you.
We have 2 more panels and 8 more speakers, so just a reminder. But I have a question for this panel, but I know Dr. Weber does first. So, okay. Dr. Weber?